When we were burying his truck in my garden, Clarissa laughed the same way she did on the day of our divorce. Back then, I didn't know it was just the beginning of our war. My garden had become my sanctuary after the divorce. Each morning, I'd wake before the sun to tend to my roses, their deep crimson petals unfurling like the memories I was trying to forget. The tulips stood in neat rows, soldiers guarding the fragile peace I'd built in this quiet Illinois suburb. The daisies, Clarissa's favorites once upon a time, dotted the landscape with innocent white faces turned toward the sky. I was pruning the rose bushes when I heard it, the unmistakable rumble of a moving truck 3 houses down. My stomach tightened as I peered through the branches. The world seemed to shift beneath my feet when I saw her stepping out of a silver sedan, her blonde hair catching the morning light just as it used to when we shared a life. Clarissa had moved into my neighborhood. My clippers slipped, slicing through my thumb instead of the stem I'd been targeting. Blood welled, but the pain felt distant compared to the shock coursing through my system. Later that week I met Rick, her new husband. He was everything I wasn't. Massive shoulders stretching his t-shirt, a military buzz cut, and hands like sledgehammers. His chrome pickup truck was as loud and imposing as he was, the engine's roar shattering the quiet mornings I'd come to cherish. The first time it happened, I thought it was an accident. Rick's truck veered off the road, cutting across the corner of my lawn. The deep tire tracks left muddy wounds in the grass I'd carefully maintained. I watched from the window, coffee growing cold in my hands, as he drove away without a backward glance. But accidents don't repeat themselves with such precision. Day after day, week after week, the truck would swerve, always hitting the same corner, always leaving deeper tracks. My protests went unheard. My carefully crafted letters requesting consideration went unanswered. Then came the strange note in my mailbox, a warning to leave Clarissa alone, though I hadn't spoken a word to her since she arrived. I recognized the handwriting instantly. It was almost comical how little Rick had tried to disguise it. I smoothed out the crumpled paper, placing it beside the wilting daisies on my kitchen table. This wasn't about territory or noise. This was about something deeper, something that had begun long before they moved onto my street. The garden was just the beginning. And so, it seemed, was the war. I was on my knees planting new marigolds when I heard the familiar growl of Rick's truck. My body tensed, but I didn't look up. Perhaps today he'd drive past without incident. Perhaps today. The engine's roar crescendoed as it swerved. Not just onto the corner of my lawn this time, but in a deliberate arc straight through my garden. The front tires tore through my prized roses, pulverizing stems and blossoms that had taken years to cultivate. The back wheels flattened my tulips, leaving nothing but crushed petals and broken stems in their wake. I dropped my trowel and stood frozen, watching as dirt and flower fragments sprayed into the air. Through the open windows of his truck, Rick's laughter carried on the spring breeze, deep, satisfied, cruel. He didn't even slow down. When I finally managed to turn around, I saw Clarissa standing on her porch 3 houses down. She sipped something from a glass, her posture relaxed as she surveyed the destruction with a smirk that sent ice through my veins. This wasn't a mistake. This was coordinated cruelty. My legs carried me down the street before my brain could advise against it. Rick was still climbing out of his truck when I reached their driveway. "You destroyed my garden," I said, my voice embarrassingly thin. Rick turned slowly, rolling his massive shoulders as if preparing for something enjoyable. "They're just flowers, man. Grow some more." His smile revealed teeth too perfect to be real. "Those roses took years too." "Years?" Clarissa's voice cut through the air as she descended the porch steps. "Imagine caring that much about plants. That's what I lived with Rick. A man who loved his flowers more than his wife." Rick nodded, slipping his arm around her waist. "That's why you needed a real man, baby. Someone who builds things, not someone who plays in the dirt like a child." Their laughter mingled as I stood there, hands clenched at my sides, dirt still fresh under my fingernails. I wanted to scream, to push him, to do something, anything, but found myself retreating, the weight of humiliation heavier than any gardening stone. Back home I surveyed the wreckage. Crushed petals. Broken stems. Tire tracks cutting through beds I'd nurtured for seasons. On my mantel sat our wedding photo, Clarissa surrounded by flowers she'd once helped me plant. The irony wasn't lost on me. I ran my soil-stained fingers across the glass frame and made a decision. This garden wasn't going to die. And neither was my dignity. It became a Saturday ritual. I'd sit with my morning coffee by the window, waiting for the rumble of Rick's chrome monster. My stomach would knot at the sound, but I refused to hide. The truck would appear, gleaming in the morning sun, and without fail Rick would swerve across my lawn and through whatever remained of my garden. I'd watch him laugh through his open window, sometimes honking as he passed. Clarissa would stand on her porch, coffee mug in hand, observing the destruction with that same smirk. Occasionally she'd wave at me mockingly, as if we were friendly neighbors sharing a morning greeting rather than bitter enemies. I tried reasoning with Rick one more time, approaching him as he washed his truck. "Look, this has gone far enough. What do you want from me?" I asked. His only response was to turn the hose in my direction, narrowly missing my shoes. "Just giving your flowers some water, flower boy," he said, his buddies laughing from the porch. The taunts evolved. Driving past my house became a performance, with Rick shouting insults through his window, "Nice weeds, buddy," or "Grow up, flower boy." Each time, Clarissa's laughter would echo behind him, a familiar sound that once accompanied happier memories. Sleep became impossible. I'd lie awake replaying their taunts, the destruction, and my own inaction. I felt like a spectator in my own humiliation. I spoke to Officer Jenkins, our neighborhood policeman, but he simply suggested I build a stronger fence. "Property disputes between neighbors are common, Marcus," he said. "Usually works itself out. But this wasn't working out." My neighbors saw what was happening. Old Mrs. Henley across the street, the young couple with the newborn next door, they all witnessed it but turned away, not wanting to get involved. One morning Rick truly crossed the line. Not content with merely driving through the garden, he spent the night uprooting everything that remained, breaking the fence I'd just repaired, leaving nothing but bare earth where life had struggled to return. Among the debris I found something unexpected: Rick's military dog tag, apparently lost during his rampage. The engraved motto caught my eye: "Destroy enemies, leave no trace." He'd failed at the latter. And that mistake would cost him. I sat on my back porch, staring at the devastation of my once thriving garden. Moonlight revealed the full extent of Rick's destruction: torn roots protruding from soil like broken bones, flower beds reduced to muddy pits. Sleep had become a distant memory, my mind consumed with thoughts of revenge. Yet unlike Rick, I wasn't interested in brute force. Violence wasn't my language, strategy was. I fingered the dog tag in my pocket and reached for my phone. 3 rings later, a familiar voice answered. "Marcus? It's been what, 2 years?" "Too long, David," I replied. "David Myers, my college roommate turned successful attorney. I need legal advice." I explained my situation while David listened quietly, occasionally asking clarifying questions. "You need irrefutable evidence," he finally said. "Documentation, witnesses, timestamps. Build a case that can't be dismissed as a neighborhood squabble." The conversation ended with a promise of help if I could gather proper evidence. Sleep came easier that night with the beginnings of a plan taking shape. At dawn, I called another old friend, Kel Benton, a former engineering student who lived outside town and had a talent for mechanical ingenuity. He owed me a favor after I'd helped him when his truck broke down last summer. "So this jerk's been destroying your garden?" Kel asked after I explained. "And the cops won't help?" "Not without concrete proof." "What you need," Kel said with a mischievous tone I remembered well from college, "are smart traps. Non-harmful but effective deterrents." He paused. "I might have some ideas." The next day, Kel arrived in his beaten-up pickup, the bed filled with equipment. We spent hours working, installing a thin rubber mat beneath a layer of soil, wired to deliver a mild electric shock, at the exact spot where Rick always drove through. We concealed cold water sprinklers among the surviving plants, positioned to activate upon pressure. Under my porch we installed a waterproof speaker. "When he drives over the mat," Kel explained, "it'll trigger the sprinklers and this." He played a sample, a horrifying, otherworldly screech that made my skin crawl. Finally, we mounted surveillance cameras aimed at my yard, hidden within bird houses and garden ornaments. As evening fell, Kel packed up his tools while I found an old box containing memorabilia from my life with Clarissa. Ticket stubs, photos, a pressed flower from our first date. Reminders of when our love had been real before it curdled into whatever drove her now. "You sure about this?" Kel asked, eyeing my distant expression. I pocketed Rick's dog tag and nodded. "I'm done being their victim." I waited by the window that night, a cup of coffee cooling between my palms. The street was silent, streetlights casting long shadows across my ruined garden. Every passing minute stretched like taffy, my nerves wound tight with anticipation. At 2 in the morning, the familiar rumble of Rick's truck broke the suburban silence. I straightened in my chair, pulse quickening as headlights swept across my front yard. The truck slowed as it approached my house, then deliberately veered toward my property line, just as predictable as the sunrise. I watched, hardly breathing, as the front wheels crossed onto my lawn. In an instant everything changed. The truck lurched to a violent stop. Inside the cab, Rick's silhouette jerked forward, his startled shout audible even through my closed window. The electrical mat had done its job. The sprinklers activated next, sending jets of ice-cold water through his open windows. Rick's cursing reached new decibels as he was drenched, twisting in his seat like a cat dropped in a bathtub. Then came the sound, a demonic howl that echoed down the quiet street, so convincingly horrifying that even I felt goosebumps rising on my arms. The combination proved too much. Rick tried reversing, but his tires spun uselessly in the mud. Lights flickered on in neighboring houses, curious faces appearing at windows. Clarissa came running from their house in a silk robe, apparently awakened by the commotion. She rushed toward the truck, only to step onto the pressure-sensitive mat herself. The electric shock made her yelp and jump backward, directly into the spray of a sprinkler. Her scream joined the cacophony as she stood drenched, nightgown clinging to her body, mascara running down her cheeks. I stepped onto my porch, feigning confusion like someone just awakened. "What's going on out here?" I called, noting with satisfaction how the cameras were capturing everything. "You sick bastard!" Clarissa shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at me. "We're calling the police." "Please do," I replied calmly. "I have hours of video showing your husband destroying my property. I'm sure the officers would be interested in seeing it." Their faces fell as the implications sank in. Rick struggled with his truck, which refused to start, something in the electrical system fried by the shock. "You'll regret this," he growled, but the threat sounded hollow now. I smiled, savoring the image of them retreating to their house, soaking wet and humiliated. For the first time in weeks, I slept deeply that night, the video evidence of their defeat safely backed up to 3 different devices. The morning after the trap incident, I watched Rick through my kitchen window. His truck sat awkwardly in his driveway, tilted as if wounded. Rick paced inside their living room, his silhouette moving frantically back and forth past the curtains. For the first time since they'd moved in, I enjoyed my morning coffee without dread. Around noon, a black sedan pulled up to my driveway. A man in a charcoal suit emerged, clutching a manila envelope. "Marcus Miller?" he asked, extending the envelope with a practiced smile. "You've been served." Inside was an official document, a cease and desist order claiming I was harassing Rick with dangerous devices, and demanding I remove all weaponized contraptions from my property. I folded the paper carefully and placed it beside my laptop, where footage of Rick's vandalism played on repeat. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had no intention of removing my protective measures. Later that afternoon, I met Jack Thompson, the retired military veteran who lived at the end of our street. He'd witnessed Rick's truck fiasco and stopped by to offer support. "That Rick fellow," Jack said, leaning on my fence, "got dishonorably discharged for aggressive behavior. Rumor has it he couldn't control his temper even in the field." That night, the petty vandalism began. I stepped onto my porch the next morning to find ketchup packets squeezed over my garden gnomes, their ceramic faces dripping with red. Empty beer cans nestled in my flower beds like bizarre aluminum blooms. 2 days later, garbage littered my lawn, fast food wrappers, cigarette butts, and a pile of used cat litter by my porch steps. The cameras caught only shadows. Rick had studied their blind spots well. I spotted Clarissa and Rick watching me from across the street, their eyes hard with hatred. When our gazes met, they didn't look away. This was war now, openly declared. The escalation continued. My tires were slashed one morning before work. Strange phone calls came in the dead of night. When I answered, the line went dead. Each incident was just below the threshold that would justify police intervention. Just petty enough to be dismissed, just targeted enough to make my life miserable. I fingered Rick's dog tag in my pocket, running my thumb over the engraved motto. Perhaps he'd forgotten his own advice, leave no trace. The tag was evidence, something concrete I could use. But I needed more. And judging by the increasing boldness of their attacks, I wouldn't have to wait long for them to make a critical mistake. Movement at the edge of my yard caught my eye as I sat reading late that night. The shadow was barely perceptible, a figure crouching, advancing in short bursts between pools of darkness. I slid my laptop open, pulling up the live feed from my surveillance cameras. The garage camera captured it perfectly. Rick hunched over with a large bag clutched to his chest. His features were momentarily illuminated as he passed beneath the neighbor's security light. I watched, barely breathing, as he reached the perimeter of what remained of my garden. With deliberate movements, he began sprinkling the contents of his bag across the soil, a white substance that glinted in the moonlight. Salt. He was salting the earth to ensure nothing would grow again. This time, though, his face was clearly visible on the camera near the garage. The footage was perfect, irrefutable evidence of deliberate property damage. As I downloaded the video file, I noticed something else. A small recording device nestled in the bushes beside my porch. When I retrieved it, I realized it had been placed to capture conversations on my porch, but it had accidentally recorded Rick instead. "Teach that flower-loving wimp a lesson he won't forget," Rick's voice emerged from the tiny speaker. "After the salt, we'll move on to something more permanent. Don't worry about evidence, I've been trained to leave no trace." My hands trembled as I dialed the local police station, no longer willing to wait for Officer Jenkins. This had crossed from harassment into something darker. 2 officers arrived within 20 minutes, a young man with a military-style haircut and an older woman with stern eyes who introduced herself as Officer Grant. "I have everything documented," I said, leading them to my laptop. "Video of him vandalizing my property tonight, audio of him planning it, and a collection of footage showing a pattern of harassment." The officers reviewed the evidence in silence. Officer Grant's expression hardened as she watched Rick pouring salt across my garden beds. "This is clear property damage," she said finally. "And that audio suggests premeditation." They walked across the street to Rick and Clarissa's house. I watched from my window as Rick emerged, chest puffed and indignant. His protests died quickly when Officer Grant showed him the footage on her phone. The younger officer placed handcuffs on Rick while he blustered about neighborhood disputes and overreactions. Clarissa burst from the house in a bathrobe, her shrieks cutting through the night air. "This is ridiculous. You can't arrest him for this." "Ma'am, destruction of property is a criminal offense," Officer Grant explained calmly. "Your husband will be spending the night in a cell." Officer Grant returned to inform me I should come to the station tomorrow to press formal charges. "The video evidence is compelling," she added. "Rick spent that night in jail. Clarissa remained at home shooting venomous glares at my house." From an upstairs window of their home, I noticed a young face watching. Aiden, Rick's stepson, eyes wide with tears as he witnessed his stepfather's arrest. Around noon the next day, Rick's truck rumbled back into the neighborhood. It moved slower than usual, as if even the vehicle carried the shame of the previous night's events. I watched through my blinds as Rick stomped into the house, shoulders hunched in defeat. Clarissa paced on their front porch, phone pressed to her ear, gesturing wildly as she spoke. Her voice carried across the street in sharp fragments: "Unfair," and "humiliated," and "lawyer." The neighborhood dynamics had shifted overnight. Mrs. Henley, the elderly woman across the street, brought me a plate of homemade cookies and whispered, "It's about time someone stood up to them, dear." Others nodded in my direction when I collected my mail, small gestures of solidarity that had been absent during Rick's reign of terror. That afternoon I found a threatening letter in my mailbox. Computer printed but signed with Clarissa's name, it promised that I would regret ever crossing them, and that karma comes for garden tenders too. I added it to my growing file of evidence and double-checked my security system. At 3 in the morning, a crackling sound pulled me from uneasy dreams. Through my bedroom window, I spotted an orange glow at the edge of my property. My garbage bin by the curb was engulfed in flames. I raced outside with my garden hose, heart pounding as I doused the fire. The plastic bin had half melted, the flames licking dangerously close to the dry grass near my house. If I'd woken just minutes later, the fire might have reached my home. As I extinguished the last embers, I noticed the flames had begun to spread to the dry grass alongside my driveway. With frantic movements, I managed to soak the area before the fire could advance further. The camera footage, though dim, clearly showed a slender figure, unmistakably Clarissa, darting away from the bin moments before the flames erupted. This was no longer petty vandalism. This was arson, a dangerous felony that could have burned down my house while I slept. The next morning, Brielle Knox, the teenage girl from 2 doors down, knocked on my door. Her drone hovered behind her like an obedient pet. "I saw what happened last night," she said, her voice quiet but determined. "I've been flying my drone at night since they egged Rusty's kennel last week." Rusty was her beloved retriever. "I caught the whole thing on video." She handed me a USB drive. "It shows Clarissa clearly. She had a lighter and everything." The footage was perfect, high-quality night vision showing Clarissa deliberately setting fire to my garbage bin, her face illuminated by the flames as she stepped back to watch her handiwork. I took the drive straight to Officer Grant, who reviewed it with grim satisfaction. An hour later, Clarissa was led away in handcuffs, shrieking that it was all a misunderstanding. Rick tried to intervene, but the younger officer kept him at bay. "You've made enemies of the wrong people," Rick hissed as Clarissa was placed in the police car. From his second-floor window, Aiden watched the scene unfold, his young face unable to turn away from his mother's disgrace. Weeks passed. Clarissa returned home from her brief detention, but something had changed. She moved through their front yard like a ghost, her eyes downcast, her usual confident stride replaced by cautious steps. The vibrant, vengeful woman who had stood on her porch watching my humiliation was gone, replaced by someone hollow and withdrawn. The court had granted me a restraining order against Rick. He could no longer come within 100 feet of my property, a distance he observed with seething resentment, glaring from the edge of his driveway each morning when I collected my newspaper. Anonymous notes of support began appearing in my mailbox from neighbors who had apparently suffered their own torments at the hands of Rick and Clarissa but had been too intimidated to speak out. "They keyed my car last Christmas," read one. "Thank you for standing up to them." Brielle stopped by regularly, often sitting on my porch steps while I attempted to rehabilitate what remained of my garden. "Aiden's having a rough time at school," she mentioned one afternoon. "Kids are cruel. They've been taunting him about his parents getting arrested." One evening, Rick approached the invisible boundary line established by the restraining order. He stood at the exact limit, hands jammed in his pockets. "You've ruined us," he called across the distance. "The whole street thinks we're criminals. Clarissa can't even go to the grocery store without people whispering." I continued pruning my single surviving rosebush, saying nothing. "This isn't over," he added, his voice dropping. "You think you've won but—" "Dad, stop." The voice came from behind him. Aiden, Clarissa's 14-year-old son from her first marriage, stepped into view. His lanky frame was tense with anger. "You told Mom to set that fire," he accused, facing Rick. "You told her it would scare him enough to move away." Rick's face contorted. "Shut up, kid. Go back inside." But Aiden turned to me instead. "I thought it was just a joke at first. Driving through your garden seemed like stupid fun to them. I didn't know it would go this far." His eyes, so similar to Clarissa's, held genuine remorse. "He made me help. Made me scout where your cameras were pointing. Said it would make me tougher." Rick's jaw clenched, but with the neighbors watching from their windows, he retreated without further threats. A week later, a for sale sign appeared in front of their house. I watched from my kitchen window as they loaded boxes into a rented moving truck. Rick and Clarissa argued on the sidewalk, their voices carrying across the street. "This is your fault," Rick shouted. "If you hadn't gotten caught." "My fault." Clarissa's voice cracked. "You're the one who started this whole thing." By the end of summer they were gone without saying goodbye. The neighbors began emerging more often, the street returning to the peaceful place it had once been. In my desk drawer, I still kept the dried remains of Clarissa's wedding bouquet, flowers I had once gathered from my own garden for the woman I thought would be by my side forever. Months passed after Rick and Clarissa's departure. Autumn leaves gathered in the corners of my yard as I worked methodically to heal the damaged soil. Through neighborhood gossip, I learned they were divorcing. Rick had moved to another city, while Clarissa lived in a small apartment with Aiden, reportedly attending anger management classes as part of her plea agreement. On a crisp October morning, a hesitant knock at my door surprised me. Aiden stood on my porch, clutching a small potted marigold, his eyes downcast. Hi Mr. Miller," he mumbled. "We moved across town. Mom's still pretty mad but not, crazy mad like before." He thrust the pot toward me. "I grew this in science class. Thought maybe you could use it. For your garden." I accepted the gift, noticing his hands were dirt-stained like a true gardener's. "Thank you, Aiden. That's thoughtful of you. I wanted you to know." He continued, shifting his weight. "We're not all like that. And Mom." He pulled a folded note from his pocket. "She won't come herself, but she wrote this." The note was brief. My anger clouded my judgment. "I'm sorry for what I did to your garden, Clarissa." I planted Aiden's marigold that afternoon in a fresh section of soil away from the salt-poisoned area. In the following weeks I added more, daisies, tulip bulbs, and even a few rose bushes that would bloom next spring. Neighbors contributed to the rebirth. Mrs. Henley brought cuttings from her garden. Brielle visited with her dog Rusty, who seemed to enjoy digging in places I strategically directed him toward. Sometimes Aiden would visit on weekends. We never discussed Rick or the incidents directly, but he seemed to find peace in helping me turn soil and plant seedlings. For his birthday, I gave him a book on gardening that made his eyes light up with genuine gratitude. The garden slowly transformed. Not a replica of what had stood before, but something new, more communal, more resilient. Even the salt damage section began showing signs of life as I implemented specialized soil restoration techniques. One day, I received a letter with Clarissa's name in the corner. Inside was a more substantial apology and a request for forgiveness. When I'm ready. I placed it in my desk drawer, neither answering nor discarding it. Most evenings I sit on my porch with coffee, watching the twilight settle over my flowers. The tire tracks have faded. The fence stands stronger than before. Green shoots emerge from the once salted earth. I no longer feel hatred toward Clarissa and Rick. What matters is reclaiming what's mine and moving forward. The garden has taught me that even the most devastated ground can, with care and time, support new life. This morning, I noticed the first bloom emerging on the previously salted soil, a single persistent daisy pushing through against all odds. Some might call it a miracle. I call it vindication.